Joining me now is Michael Moynihan, who is 1/3 of the Fifth Column. So if you're thinking, is it a 15th? No, the Fifth Column is a great podcast with Michael and Matt Welsh and Camille Foster. But you know, Moynihan and I, we could talk about anything. But what I always pepper him with questions on is Sweden. I'm fascinated by Sweden. And, well, first of all, Moynihan, welcome to The Gist. You've not been on yet.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be on. It's a great podcast. And I'm really offended that this is the first time I've been on.
Well, you know, we have quality control.
Yeah.
So you lived in Sweden. You
I did.
Speak Swedish.
I do.
You are Swedish?
No.
How did you come to be
when you see a
non-permanent Swede?
Yes, when you see someone in Sweden who is not Swedish,
yeah,
and you usually can tell because they're smiling, and it's like, oh, there's an American, or they're deranged, and it's you ask the question, it's always a woman. Sweden, it just brings people in because of women, and that was the case for me, and it was right after 9/11 that I met this woman who would later become my wife and the mother of the greatest child to ever live, and you know, we were there for 5 years, 6 years, something like that. Maybe less. I can't even remember. It's a blur because I remember that when I really moved, it was the first week of the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
Which really transformed my life there.
Did you want to get out of America specifically during that time?
No, I want to get out of New York. I was in New York on 9/11, and it was a bit of a jarring experience. And I don't think people remember, but the idea that something else was going to happen, it was going to be sort of cascading attacks, because everyone thought this.
They nabbed a couple Middle Easterners on a train with $1,000 in cash.
Correct.
Everything was a sell, a potential
and they were
sell.
coming back from Atlantic City. But yeah, that was I was kind of desperate to get out of New York. But New York always pulls you back. So I was there for a number of years, and Sweden can really grind you down in a very Swedish way, in a way that it's the opposite of New York. It's a very pleasant, kind of bucolic place. Everything functions really well, but it's also very Swedish. So.
Yeah. So this is okay.
I love the country, and I love all my friends there, and I don't want me to say mean things about Sweden.
This explains Midsummer, which is this like pleasant experience that actually, when you look under it, drives you mad and grinds you down. So you went there as a journalist, but not a Swede. No,
I went there as a citizen and became a journalist there.
Oh, okay. So you hadn't done journalism here in America beforehand?
Nope.
You're just, a curious guy who knew things?
I wanted to be a journalist, and I thought at the time that one had to have some sort of technical training, like being a doctor or something, to go to journalism school, which is not only turned out to be
read
wrong.
A lot of journalism, I know that
is the opposite of what I would recommend to people who want to be a journalist. But when I was there, I noticed that I didn't sign up to be an ambassador from the United States, but I became an ambassador from the United States because every dinner party you went to, Iraq had just started, and you had to answer every question.
Right.
And I became like a defender of the Iraq War in a way that I look back on, like, just kind of mystified by. But then I realized I was young and I felt set upon by everybody.
Right.
And I became very kind of nationalistic and patriotic. I'm like, why are you guys all making fun of my country? And so it was right after 9/11, that kind of wound was pretty raw. And so I started writing. And I started a website there that became instantly infamous, I guess.
Why? For what?
Well, because it essentially was like, there were multiple contributors, but I was the most kind of pugnacious of them, shall we say. And I guess I was a bit more of a neocon back then. And so it was called the Stockholm Spectator. And the main newspaper, the biggest, like the New York Times of Sweden, a paper called Dagens Nyheter, they had a columnist there who wrote about it and referred to it as the SS because of Stockholm Spectator. But,
oh, wow,
we understand that we were getting at. Yeah. So it was a weird it was a time when
By the way, for us in America, that's an insult. For Sweden,
it was like, you guys let the trains through.
Yeah.
So maybe you like these people.
Maybe you know a little.
But I, at that point, did not mind being disliked. Right. I didn't mind people throwing punches at me. I do now. I don't like it anymore. And that's why I don't tweet very much. I don't like that kind of engagement, but that's what I did in Sweden.
What was your language skill acquisition?
I put it this way. My then girlfriend said to me, when you speak Swedish, you sound like a radio announcer.
Oh,
and I said,
that's
well,
not
that's
bad.
good. And she's like, no, it's very strange. It's because I learned by listening to the radio and watching television, because you notice in Europe, people who have very good English language skills are, for instance, Scandinavians. Why is that education system? No, they don't dub anything. They only dub children's movies. So if you go to the theater, the cinema, you're seeing an American movie in English with subtitles. Same thing is true of television. So I watched like Seinfeld, and I would just read the subtitles and start figuring it out. And they had a thing called SFE, which is like Swedish for foreigners, basically, for a free class. And I didn't want to go because everyone said, like, it's literally a bunch of like confused Somalis who like you'll never learn anything because no one has any idea what's going on. So I just learned it.
It's like the Harold Ramis scene in Stripes. A matter on a Sunday. You do the Duran in Swedish.
The worst thing about it is that Swedes are so good at English and they don't have an opportunity at that point, like a frequent opportunity to speak English. So the second you make a mistake in Swedish, like, oh, we'll just speak English. And it became very difficult to learn Swedish because nobody wanted to speak Swedish.
How do you say close talker in Swedish?
Knowing the Swedes would be close talker. Oh. Like they make everything anglicized, like Americanized. So there's like a lot of words that it's funny because my daughter has a Swedish passport. Her mother is Swedish. She is technically a Swede herself, and she does not speak Swedish. And so it is. I tried to speak Swedish when she was young, and she understood it and had no interest. It was like, no one else speaks this. I don't hear it anywhere else. It seems like there's no utility to speaking this. And she was right. Of course, it's like, nobody speaks Swedish. So I have a daughter who's Swedish who doesn't speak Swedish.
Didn't Osama bin Laden specify and point to Sweden as one country that specifically pissed him off?
Possibly.
No, there was a Scandinavian country that came in one of his decrees that came in for criticism by bin Laden.
It's possible.
Norway, Sweden, I'm trying to remember.
Well, Norway had, for a very long time, a guy named Mulla Krekar, who they finally deported him. And this has been a thing in Scandinavia, is that getting rid of people that really should not be in your country and who hate your country and are usually living off the welfare state. And so it might have been that they were horribly mean about, it could have been Denmark too, because of the cartoon crisis, which is 2005 and 6.
No, I think this was in, I'll look
it was the 90s.
Well,
it was old school bin Laden. It was his first couple records.
That's right. It's before he sold out. Okay, so I'm glad we laid the predicate. What I really am interested in is Sweden has become a couple things. And for most of my life, it was the thing that the American left socialists would point to as not the socialist, the kind of socialists who always wanted to deny that they were communists, and maybe even Marxists would say, no, Sweden-style socialism.
Yes. They still say that.
They still say it. And I remember all these textbooks would always point to the Scandinavian countries, but Sweden primarily, because before oil prices spiked, they were actually much better economically than Norway, and they would import the Norwegians in, and then Norwegians were seen as the underclass. So Sweden...
And for listeners, keeping in mind that Norway, of course, is a special exception because it has oil, and an enormous amount of oil.
And it's huge sovereign wealth fund, and that changed everything. So for much of my life, Sweden was something of the ideal of a very functional socialism where they didn't control the means of production, but wouldn't it be nice if we could have what Sweden had? And I always just thought about it or rebutted it by saying it's an extremely homogeneous country of 8 million people?
About 10 million now. It was 9 when I lived there.
Right.
It's increased by a lot.
Right. So probably when I was
25% of the country now, I think, is foreign born.
So it's just like saying, wouldn't it be nice if, and then sub in the state, Wisconsin, or let's live like Minnesota, but much more homogeneous. But having lived there, how much of the socialist ideal is real?
Not a lot, actually. You mentioned Wisconsin, which is the kind of the only region in America that ever had socialists that ran anything, the La Follettes of the world, and you'd have mayors that were socialists and everything, because it came from Scandinavian stock. Right. It's really interesting. If you look at the success of Sweden, Sweden's an incredibly rich country, but all of those periods of decline in Sweden, periods of hyperinflation in Sweden, were when the Social Democrats were going mad, and they like the 70s particularly is when when they pull out of these tailspins, like in the early 90s, it was because of a conservative government. Now the conservative government, keeping in mind Sweden is a rather different thing. Literally the most Swedish thing in the world is the name of the conservative party in Sweden is Moderaterna, which means the moderates. It's just like the most Swedish, like our conservatives are actually moderates. So there's all of this stuff that happened where for a long time there was no innovation in Sweden. Like of the 50 largest Swedish companies, like they were all started in like 1920.
Yeah.
There was not a lot of innovation.
Volvo.
Which is now owned by a Chinese company. So Volvo's not even Swedish anymore. And Saab, in a wonderful example of supposed socialism, was allowed to die because the government should take over this car company. It's the most Swedish brand. And they said no. And then it was purchased, I think, by a Chinese company and then later by a Dutch company. And now it just doesn't exist. But they allow things like that to happen. But there was a time, even when I was there, it was a pretty onerous place to run a business. And, like Nicholas Zennström, the guy who started Skype, all the developers and all that moved to Estonia, where there was a flat tax and there was a really highly educated workforce. And, Estonia always frames itself as being this very tech central place.
Sure. Everything's on the blockchain in Estonia.
I mean, you can get these like passports that are like for anyone if you apply. It's this weird thing. But they tried to do that and became that country. Sweden, because they started anew in 1989 when the Soviet Union fell. Sweden has started anew in a number of periods. So if you look at these periods in Swedish history, it's usually, like those really bad economic times, it's when social democrats overreach. And they really were overreaching. There's a very famous story about Astrid Lindgren, the woman who did Pippi Longstocking. And in 1976, she had her own company. And, she was like the sole proprietor. But the way the rules were the social democrats set up, her tax bill for the year was 102%. So she actually owed the government money for being successful. And she then wrote a famous thing, which was only translated, I think, about 20 years ago, but she wrote like a parable, like a story about how awful it was to live in Sweden. If those examples exist, like Ingmar Bergman, he was stopped, like I think at Arlanda Airport at one point because he was spending too much time in Switzerland or something. All the guys from ABBA, they're all domiciled in Switzerland. You get your money out of there because it is a very entrepreneurial country. The Fraser Institute, I think, does with Wall Street Journal or Heritage or something. They do these actually pretty, broad looks at like the most free market,
right,
most liberal. Sweden ranks above America. It's a high tax, very free market country.
So not a lot of regulations.
No.
But the taxes.
Yeah, the taxes. Yeah. Before Trump changed things, Sweden had a significantly lower corporate tax rate than the U.S. did. So there's a lot of stuff like that. Very high tax, but that is really fraying. And I was doing a lot of reporting after the migrant crisis in Europe. I was in Austria, went over the border in Hungary. I was in Sweden, in Italy. And I noticed something, and the Swedes would do this too, is that it was dangerous at that point to talk about immigration. People didn't want to. It was like a toxic issue. So you just, like the cordon sanitaire around that issue in the media, no one talked about it. When you talk to the average person, they talked about socialist things when they were talking about immigration. They talked about hospitals. It's very hard to get an appointment these days, right? The Sjukhus down the street is packed all the time. They're just talking about immigrants. They're talking about migrants coming in and the like sort of degradation of their services. And that's how people framed everything. So that the homogeneous point is one, well, yes, it is like, what is it, tall poppy syndrome they call it? Like
where they
and that's the
lop off anyone who stands
correct.
out. Right.
And that in Sweden is called Jantelaget, like the law of Jante. And it's like nobody gets too big. Everyone's in this together. It's a very communal experience. It's literally your local government is communal. It's the commune.
Yeah.
And that's like, so that kind of is fraying and has frayed quite a bit, I think, as a result of a number of things, but I think immigration is probably number one.
Yeah, I want to get to immigration, but let's ask you the John Rawls question. Would you rather randomly be born in whatever strata of Swedish society or American society? Maybe not you, but someone who actually was Swedish.
Yeah. It depends on what time. Right now, probably America. Growing up in some of these places,
but they don't have the crushing poverty we do.
They don't have the crushing poverty that we do. No. They also, the overlap is pretty obvious in certain points, and there's a lot of things that are very different about the countries that just could never happen. The fact that we share a border with Latin America is something that doesn't. The closest Sweden got to this was the migrant crisis, and the whole country basically lost its mind. So, I mean, those things are very different. Like, we can assimilate people in this country in ways that the Swedes just cannot figure out how to do. But yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, there's a lot of benefit to being a poor person in Sweden, for sure.
Yeah.
The healthcare system is gummed up. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in Sweden, and it was not a great experience. But after that experience, getting my insulin was great. It was easy. You go to Apoteket and you get your stuff, and it doesn't cost you. You still pay like a copay and everything. So all of that does work. At what point does it no longer work, though? And I haven't lived there in over a decade. So I'm hearing a lot of this stuff. I read the Swedish newspapers every day. And obviously people have certain motivations.
Even the old guy who called you an SS agent?
Oh my God. I just tried to remember his name and I can't even remember his name. Oh, I just didn't remember his name, but I don't want to mention it. But yeah, I still, despite that, I mean, there are papers, like one of the biggest tabloids in Europe actually is a paper called Aftonbladet. And it is possibly like the closest thing I've ever read to a version of the Daily Worker. I mean, it is like radically left-wing. And I remember getting there and being totally blown away by this stuff, where no conversation with immigration ever happened in those pages. And if it did, it was to call somebody a horrible racist for discussing it. And, like it's a very, like I remember looking at an article defending the resistance in Iraq. And I was like, guys, this is not what you think it is. Which eventually turns into ISIS.
Yeah. Or maybe, just to be fair, it was the former Baathists.
Yeah, they did have a bit of a Baathist vibe to them.
Bathy, a little Bathy. Yeah. Let's talk about immigration. What are the numbers? And they don't, as you say, they don't know how to handle it. But one initiative, and tell me if this is for show or if they expect people to take them up on this. They are paying immigrants, or vowed to pay immigrants, 350,000 kroner, which is like $35,000. Is that legit? They expect people to do it?
I don't think they expect people to do it. I don't know. If
and they won't do it because the people there, their government funded assistance is so much better than the 35,000.
I mean, look, if you think of it this way, they're the far right party. I don't like that term because it doesn't really make sense in America. Just say they're a populist party. The Sweden Democrats.
And they're the ones that we call the former Nazis, or they
did start as a Nazi, but they're a Nazi-aligned party.
Right.
It's very different now, and people tend not to mention that, but it is worth mentioning.
Here in America, we mention it.
Yeah,
I mentioned it, and then I got some blowback saying it's the only way to have some sort of expression of unease with the waves of immigration.
Yeah,
like Sweden's in this position where no one else is really talking about it.
No one's really talking about
like
it.
They are, yeah.
And the Sweden Democrats, I remember they pulled this stunt one time where they went to Greece and they handed out pamphlets and put them out for all these migrants saying, we don't want you in Sweden. And the question about that, which was pretty interesting, is like, migrants are rational people. They're rational economic actors.
Right.
They get to Greece. It's like, well, this is a pretty temperate climate. This is pretty much very similar to it's not Syria, but it's right. It's close.
They're olives.
Close. They're olives. Yeah. And
we're going to go olives.
Lemons, olives. It's the same shit. But we're going to trek across land to the coldest, most unforgiving climate than we could possibly imagine. Why? Well, there's an apartment waiting for you. There's incredible social services waiting for you, which, of course, become less incredible as the place fills up. And, I think there's a little, when people say 20, I mentioned this and I should have had a caveat. People say 25% of the country now is basically foreign-born, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It does also include Finns, like Finlandssvensk is you say Finnish Swedes. So there's it's the second official language of Finland. Helsinki has a daily newspaper in Swedish, right? And there's like that kind of colony of Finnish Swedes. So there's like Finns and there's other people.
Yeah.
So it's not all, people try to make you think it's all migrants. It's not, but there's a huge number of migrants. And they took proportionally.
You could live in Malmo and work in Copenhagen, and you might want to actually do that.
Yeah, and it's the percentage of migrants that were coming into the migrant crisis, the Swedes took the highest percentage per capita. And it was a wild, wild situation.
And because they said that's just who we are, like Canada did?
That's right. That's who we are. And I went up to these places. They called them Isil Boemba. There's like these asylum houses. It was like an old a summer camp. It was like literally would be a summer camp in the summer. And I think it was in Umeå, like way up Arctic Circle, like coldest place you can get. And I went up there and shot a story there. And the story that
This was when? How long ago?
2018, I think. And the story I was doing was actually that the confessional difficulties that you got in the Middle East were now manifesting themselves in Sweden. So there was a fire at one of these places. And of course, the hand-wringing started, the newspaper columns, the racism that is. And it turned out it was like a Shia group that was mad at a Sunni group, and they burned it down. And there was all this all these tensions that were being brought into Sweden. And I went in there to shoot, and at some point, we had to leave this big dining hall because we were surrounded by people that were threatening us. And they were like, "Get the fucking cameras out of here! You don't." And they also, a news story came at the exact same place that they had been complaining about Swedish food, which they didn't like. And all of this stuff was building with Swedes. And they're very polite, very nice people, but only for so long. If you see a story saying, "We don't like your food," it's like, I'm paying, I'm giving this, come on guys. And so there was an accumulation of that, and then crime. And the crime thing is really, really out of control. I mean, Sweden, when I went there and being the ambassador, the unofficial American ambassador, if it wasn't Iraq, it was gun crime. It was always like, guns, you are so crazy with your guns. And it's like, oh, here we go again. Now, the numbers aren't even close to America, but Sweden is the gun crime capital of Europe now.
Yeah.
More so, there's more gun crime in Malmö, Gothenburg, Stockholm than there is in London by a lot.
Right.
And that's,
London's maybe not the best. I mean, it is low.
They have London is
like
low.
18 murders a year in Sweden.
It's up.
Maybe in Malmo. Or
it's up.
Yeah.
But it's gone up consistently.
But also
years,
explosions are big.
Explosions,
too,
hand grenades, bombings. Because there's a guy called the Kurdish Fox, who's this gang leader. It's gang stuff. It's not Islamist stuff necessarily. Although, a week ago there were two brothers, Swedish, like Rasmussen, kind of like last name, like a Danish name, but like brothers who were arrested for planning to blow something up in like an ISIS-style plot. So it's not just that. I mean, they do have a huge problem with Islamism. And there was proportionally, I think, also the country that was giving the most soldiers to ISIS. Yeah. Belgium, Sweden, and places like that.
Were there mistakes made along the way where there were prominent people in Sweden saying, "I told you so"? Was this all done over the objections of the forces of Swedish government, like would happen here? Yeah. Or was it more like where Sweden would let it happen and they were generally surprised at how it turned out?
I mean, it's sort of like after the 19th, this is a famous, I'm going to get it wrong, but the exact language of it, but there's a famous that Bertolt Brecht in 1953, after the uprising in East Germany, wrote this poem, which he supported the sort of crushing of this workers' revolt. And he said that the joke of it was the party wants to vote in a new people. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what you felt in Sweden. It's like, we don't trust you as a people. Please don't talk about these issues. We're not going to have them in the newspaper. And what happens immediately? Immediately. It's internet age. There are so many online sites, online only, that are alternative news platforms, like the Breitbarts of Sweden, the Daily Callers of Sweden, the Free Press of Sweden. I mean, the ones that are like they're more centrist and more normal. And then there's the extreme ones. But that ecosystem just was created almost overnight. I mean, it wasn't there when I was there. I was the only one kind of doing it, and I was doing it in English, so it wasn't penetrating in the way that these were with like just the average. The thing that Americans never realize about Europeans is that the least kind of interesting thing that you'll hear from Americans, and you're like, they're so kind of, progressive, and there's like, you're in cities. There is an Arkansas in every country in Europe. Mm-hmm. Like, go to the place where Front National is getting 70% of the vote in France. Go into the middle of Sweden, where there's a culture called ragare, where people dress up like greasers, like Americans. There's like obsession with America. It's like those places are never represented in any representations of Sweden abroad, and even in Sweden. it's like their local newspapers and everything. But that whole swath of people were ignored and said, just trust us on this one. The immigration stuff's going to be fine. And if you object to this, you're probably one of these Nazis. Now, when that party, Sweden Democrats, when I left Sweden, when I first got to Sweden, it was probably 0.2% or something. It's now the second biggest party in Sweden. Sometimes it's the third, sometimes the second. It's sometimes been, I thought was like, man, this might be the most popular party. That hasn't happened yet. But you look at the same thing in Germany.
AFD.
AFD is now on people's tongues because of Elon Musk, and he'd been tweeting that AFD is the salvation of Germany. But I mean, people don't know, Frauke Petri or Björn Höcke and these guys, they don't know like, oh, well, she's a Nazi and this one isn't, and they have this internal fight. They just know this is kind of a Nazi party. And you see that last week in the Bundestag, there was something tabled about banning AfD. I think is in opinion polls 22% now.
Yeah.
It is about 6 points above SPD, above the Social Democrats.
Yeah.
Like the Social Democrats are losing, and they're talking about banning them. And I saw that and I said, guys, look north. Look what happened in Sweden. They tried to do the same thing, tried to not ban them as such, but just run them out of polite society. And the voters didn't care.
Yeah.
They said, no, this is a problem. We're seeing it, and we're going to vote for them anyway.
But in a place like Sweden, without the striations of economics, is it as an elite driven phenomenon?
Correct.
But the elites, it's not that the elites are richer, it's more that the elites
There are a lot of rich people in Sweden. I mean, that's kind of a thing that people don't, I guess, cop onto. I mean, the neighborhoods in Stockholm, you look at real estate in Stockholm now.
Yeah.
These apartments are $3-4 million when you translate it from crowns. And, there's people that live in government housing.
So it's still populist. It's still a populist uprising, even when
Yeah.
the income inequality is flattened.
Correct. There's only one party that I think I would say that is more old school conservative, like Republican conservative, that is populist on immigration in all of Europe, that actually believes in the free market. And that's the Progress Party in Norway. They've been more like, Milton Friedman types. In Sweden, Sweden Democrats are like a left-wing party, and that's like on economics. And that's what makes them popular. You can appeal to those people because they are very skeptical of immigration and they're of sort of low economic status.
So does that tell you that arguments about why is populism popular in America, income inequality is always explanation 1 or 2? Does that tell you it's not the right explanation?
No, I think it's part of the explanation. I mean, keeping in mind that the income inequality and like you look at Gini coefficients over time is that party in the Republican Party that spent so many years, basing their economic policy on like Cato, AEI, Heritage white papers, and Heritage has obviously changed now, but that kind of message was like the income inequality was big. You're still shopping at Walmart. You're like a white person who's been here, and then everyone around you is Ecuadorian in the Walmart. I mean, I've heard these complaints from people because I've done a lot of immigration stories in the U.S. too. In that kind of thing, it just was like, is it Trump's genius or is it a kind of an accident that actually Le Pen style politics would be much more popular? Because the Republican Party was popular amongst, red state, blue state stuff. And, obviously that's a gross oversimplification. But at the same time, it's like you hit them with economic populism and it's like, and then the guy who's doing it is a TV star and he's funny. It's like, that's an easy one. That makes perfect sense.
What about the critique that these far-right parties, so far we've talked about, no one else was voicing these issues. The people felt these issues. There was a market need for that. But what about the critique with Le Pen, with AFD? They are still racist. Like, don't chalk up all of their appeal to just a market inefficiency. Like, racism's part of it, and the people who support them like a little bit of the racism.
I think there's a huge amount of truth to that, and I don't mean to minimize it at all. And it's racism, but in a sense that Italy is a very good example of this, because I think Italy, it's much more obvious in the conversation that you see. And I think Meloni has been a great example of somebody who has that old style Mussolini. Like, I mean, when she was in the youth party, they would like praise Mussolini. This is like a very common thing. And the same kind of socialist policies of Mussolini too. But she's kind of become a little more of a mainstream figure. And kind of the Mattiotis, like, the Northern League types, are much more explicit, I think, about the racism. And it's the changing face of your country.
Yeah.
And look, there is the culture of Italy. Like, Italians love being Italian. And they'll tell you everything about being Italian. And they look at people coming in, and Lampedusa is full of Africans, and they say, that's not Italian. It's too much of that. We're fine with a little bit of that, but that's too much.
Yeah.
It's a type of racism, obviously.
Right.
But it is also...
But it's also nationalism, and it's also defining yourself.
Correct.
Borders should mean something.
Yes.
And I should also say, in the American context, we have more of leeway as to that's American and that's not American.
Yes.
Like, you like baseball and can make a couple of cultural references, you're fine.
Yeah.
Except to, the worst 10% of us, I would think.
I mean, that was always the joke in those World War II movies, is you knew it was a German spy because they asked, like, what did
Who was
Mickey
in the
Mantle...
World Series last
What
year?
did Mickey Mantle hit last year? And you're like, he's a kraut.
Yeah. Now would it have to be like, who was in the UFC championship?
Yeah,
like, who watches baseball?
Exactly.
I'm 21. No one watches
I think it's
baseball.
Dana White. Is that the person? But yeah, that kind of stuff is like, it's clear also in Sweden. And I think that what you would see, like I mentioned Frauke Petri, who was the head of AFD, the German party. And she left the party and wrote a book about like the party going into hands of people like Björn Höcke, who is like basically a Nazi sympathizer. And in a lot of ways is a Nazi sympathizer. And of course, these parties are much bigger in the East. Another thing we can blame communism for, former East Germany, AfD does much, much better than it does in the west of the country.
Well, they're also more economically depressed to this day.
Correct, to this day. But they, out of the gate, were in 91, like those parties were becoming very successful because they were actively suppressed by the state, and the state was officially an anti-fascist state. It was literally in the title. The German Democratic Republic was an anti-fascist state. And so, it's kind of like the punk rock thing to do, I guess, is be a fascist in 1991. But you see also her issue. And she says, they're Nazis and blah, blah, blah. Because her issue, she was attacking Islam. And that's like, you guys are probably anti-Semites and you guys are probably racist of all types of variety. I just didn't want minarets in this town and did too many Muslims, and it's creating a subculture that doesn't have our values and is extremist. There's a lot of that too. And what happens is you will have, I'll give you a really crazy example of this. There was a documentary that came out in 2003 in Sweden, and it was something about integration, and it was like sport and integration, a Swedish success story kind of thing. And I just looked this up the other day, and I found the review of it, and it's about this family and the kid who's a Syrian, born in Malmö, but his parents are Syrian refugees, and he's saying he's a young kid, and he's like through sport, I'm getting closer to Sweden, and I, have all these friends and blah, blah, blah. That kid was just charged in Sweden yesterday with the death of the Jordanian pilot who was burned alive by ISIS. They can't do anything now because that Swedish kid, who was the great success story, is in prison in Paris for his complicity in the Bataclan massacre, and then the Belgian attack in 2016. 3 major things, right? And he was an example of Swedes notice this stuff. And they are the race.
What sport, by the way? Soccer, hockey?
I think it was soccer, yeah. And I mean, well, it's funny because the most, the best player in the New York Rangers is a Swedish guy with an Iranian name. Yeah. And he plays hockey. But yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of success stories too. And it's really, I hate talking about these things because I know a lot of people who are Middle Eastern or Iraqi and Syrian and stuff. And they're like more hawkish on immigration sometimes than, just white Swedes named Sven, So it's a mixed bag, of course. But like the racism stuff, I think in Sweden is a lot of it that it is like actually like we don't think that Muslims can integrate into Sweden, and we like being Swedish. I mean, Fredrik Reinfeldt, the quote unquote conservative prime minister, got in a lot of trouble during an election campaign when he said there's no such thing as Swedish culture.
Right.
Yeah. And that was really, people said, nope, that's not true. And also by doing what we're doing as policy, we're watering down that culture that you say doesn't exist.
So what is the way forward? Is it that by way forward for fans of pluralism or functional government or lowering crime rates, Is it for these erstwhile center-left parties, the Social Democrats or the versions thereof in these other countries, which have been discredited and doesn't seem like they're going to have a way back, for them to reinvigorate? Is it for the far-right parties to have a go at it and to show that they're equally incompetent? Or is it, and what I'm hearing from you, an articulation that some version of the far-right parties actually can moderate and maybe be functional?
They can moderate, and also, why do they have to moderate? Because you can't govern by being a far-right party in any of these countries that do have a social democratic soul. I mean, there was for 50 of the past 70 years, Sweden was run by social democrats with these little, an interregnum here of conservatives, an interregnum when the economy starts tanking and the curtain serves and they cut. I mean, keeping in mind also Sweden, if you look at Sweden's most socialist period, it has become considerably less socialist over time. And that's why it's also become more financially successful. But I think that what you're seeing in all these countries is they have to move a little bit towards the center. But the reason they have to move towards the center is now they have competition. Because the moderate party, you couldn't talk about this stuff anymore, like in the past.
Yeah. That's a big thing you're saying.
It's the hugest
the suppression of free exchange
it was
of ideas.
in that.
And not officially, just
not officially
de facto,
all,
right?
At
just
all.
the culture.
The culture
exchange,
of it was so. In that disappearing, has allowed mainstream parties to take on those issues. So in Denmark, you have this social democratic government. There used to be a party. There was a woman named Pia Kjærsgaard, who was like this extreme woman, and the party was called Danske Folkeparti, the Danish People's Party. It was the biggest. It's gone.
Yeah.
It's because the Social Democrats are more hawkish on immigration than anyone at this point. Same thing is true in Germany. This is remember the migrant crisis happened under a conservative CDU government of Angela Merkel, right? And the CDU now is seeing 22% off day. They're still at 30%, but hey, how do we get ourselves over 50 by integrating all these people into the party? It's to be more realistic about the negative parts and the drawbacks of immigration. Unchecked migration. I'm a person who's very and has been publicly and vocally very liberal about immigration in this country. I am not so liberal about it in Europe because I think they do it in a way that Americans do it a totally different way. Integration has been a swear word in Sweden for so long. And criticizing multiculturalism, that kind of stuff was just forbidden. There was a very big website in Sweden, was an alternative news website, run by a very funny person named Chang Frick, a funny name, and I interviewed him once, and he was hilarious. Just a total wild guy, he just hair all over the place. And I went to the website.
The Al Goldstein?
Without the pornography. He's like the Screw magazine.
What is Al Goldstein? A cigar?
Yeah, a cigar and working at the Second Avenue Deli,
body
actually.
odor, yeah.
But that website I went to was very popular. It was a subscriber-based thing. It shut down.
Yeah.
And it said in this farewell kind of thing, we're going to do new projects. But the stuff that we started talking about 10 years ago, because we couldn't talk about, we talk about now. And it was in the kind of farewell note of this. And I saw this just the other day. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really interesting that kind of conversation, because it's been forced into the open. It's been forced. You cannot call 23% of the population racist and say that that's their only concern. It's the same thing you see in Donald Trump, is that 70 million Americans are unreconstructed racists, including half of Hispanic men. This doesn't make sense. So once that kind of fell away, and those parties get more mainstream people in them, that they want to steer the party. I mean, look, there's always people that fall away. The Sweden Democrats, there's a bunch of the original Nazis, and they have something called the National Democrats. It's just then there's get 0.1% of the vote in a local election or something. But they have become more professionalized. Mm-hmm. It's like the Donald Trump thing. It's you see him in his first couple of days. He did one executive order on his first day in 2017.
Yeah.
One. And 300 the other day?
Yeah.
It's because they know what they're doing now.
Yeah.
And that's maybe what makes it scary in a way, is that all these parties in Europe, these far-right parties that were fringe parties, became part of the mainstream. And now they're in the kind of mechanics of government. They know how it works, which is to the true believers often a bad thing, because they get co-opted by whatever the le swamp is in France. Le
miasma.
But keeping in mind also in France, the party is Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who died about a week and a half ago. They didn't talk for how many years? I think probably 10 years, because she took over the party and made it a party that could get 30% of the
Right,
vote.
and so he was like the national Democrat of the 0.1%.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
and so he was the one that was saying, the gas chambers were a footnote of history.
Right.
He was the one that was saying Vichy was actually not all bad.
Right.
And that's not how you win like a moderate voter who's a little annoyed about the immigration situation.
Right.
In the banlieues and seeing all the crime. And look, the thing in Sweden is that the crime is by and large an immigrant issue. And that's something people would never say before, and they do say it all the time now.
Michael Moynihan, he's part of the Fifth Column, which you should listen to, maybe even subscribe to if you want to listen to even longer conversation than this, but with more people. Moynihan, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.